Okay, so welcome everyone. It's great to see some new faces. Just as a quick introduction, I'm Toby. This is uh, maybe the third or fourth sharing session we've had for UBI Lab Arts, and these sessions are usually sort of an example where we can show and share different examples of projects which kind of help to communicate the idea of UBI, and it's been really sort of quite good, but usually they're very conversational, and this is what we would like today's session to be. Let's see, particularly with this session, I was contacted by Momoko, who wanted sort of a sort of a rundown or sort of a brief sort of idea of what UBI is. I know there's a lot of talk about UBI, especially since the start of the pandemic. The interest has grown in it, and I think that there is a lot of different interpretations and a lot of disinformation about it. So the presentation I'll start with this evening will be a kind of a basics of basic income, and like some of the trials and evidence which has happened out in the past, and I'll try and sort of state why I think that artists, musicians, and other creative producers should support the policy. After that, we'll have Andy Abbott giving sort of a talk about how he got into basic income through sort of being a DIY musician and artist. And then we have Emanuele Braga, sorry if I've pronounced your name wrong, who's going to give us an Italian perspective and talk about a manifesto that he's written for artists. Okay, so hopefully that's enough for housekeeping. If during any of the presentations, if anyone wants to ask any questions, please just unmute and just shout out. I've got a PowerPoint presentation, but I think everyone else is just going with their lovely faces. Let's see, yeah, we want it to be as conversational as possible. So we'll have short 10, 15 minute presentations, and then sort of 10, 15 minute conversation afterwards. Okay, so to start my one, I'm going to try and share my screen. I'm sure technology will manage to scupper somehow, but hopefully this will work. Okay. Let's see. Okay, so hopefully you can see the presentation now instead of the behind the scenes stuff on all my notes. Just to preface this talk, this is kind of like the basics and just sort of some of the different perspectives and different interpretations of basic income. So hopefully it won't be too boring for people who already know a lot about basic income, and hopefully it will enlighten everyone and give us sort of the starting point for a deeper conversation. Okay, so what is universal basic income? A loose description is that it's an income paid unconditionally to individuals regardless of their family or household relationships, regardless of other incomes, and regardless of their past, present, or future employment status. So the Basic Income Earth Network give a 5-point characteristic definition of basic income. So these are that a basic income should be periodic, paid at regular intervals, so every month or week. So it wouldn't be a one-off grant, for example. It should be received as a cash payment or an appropriate medium of exchange. So basically, so you can decide what you want to spend your money on. It shouldn't be tokens, which can be exchanged for food or services, which are, have a dedicated or specific use. Third, it should be paid to individuals, which, so at the moment in the UK, universal credit, which is kind of the standard unemployment benefit, that goes to households, and being paid to individuals would actually mean, but it's more emancipatory, and it would enable people to leave relationships or households which were abusive or not working for them. It should be universal, so it'd be paid to everyone without any means testing. And finally, it should be unconditional, so it can't be withdrawn, or there shouldn't be any requirement to work or to demonstrate a willingness to work or having to do any kind of other forms of participation to earn your basic income. So trials of basic income have been quite positive, and have happened all over the world, even though lots of people or skeptics try to say that there's no evidence to support basic income. But results have shown that there's increases of food security, increased sense of purpose, better trust in the community and public institutions. Participants have also reported improved mental and physical health, largely due to the reduction of the frequency and need for hospital visits. Alongside this, there's been increases in civic engagement and our participation in the labour market, with many people taking up volunteering roles and starting businesses. It's important to note that a lot of the things which get called basic income or UBI don't actually fulfill the 5 criteria which I've just mentioned above. Often they involve some kind of direct cash transfer with an element of conditionality. An example of this is the trial which happened in Finland between 2017 and 2019. This involved 2,000 people nationwide, so it wasn't universal. And also participants in the trial were people who had been claiming unemployment benefit. So the basic income was the same amount of money that they would have received if they were on unemployment. So yeah, it was just a quid pro quo. The trial removed the unconditionality of receiving it. So if a participant found any paid employment, the payments wouldn't be removed, unlike the control group who continued to receive unemployment benefit with the normal conditions. The trial was branded a failure by the media, largely because there was only a 1% increase in the number of days worked by those receiving the UBI. And this reveals the limitations of the perspective of the trial and the sort of intended outcomes. Although the findings do disprove the myth that unconditional money would be a disincentive to work and would cause laziness. So skeptics of basic income and the media generally ignored many of the positive outcomes of the Finnish trial, which included higher life satisfaction, improved well-being, feeling less mental strain and more compared to the control group. And participants also stated that there was a greater sense of trust in other people and public institutions, and they were more confident about their future, economic welfare, and felt a greater sense of autonomy. So since the start of the pandemic in the UK, support for basic income trials have grown dramatically. The furlough scheme is seen by some as a kind of a version of basic income, albeit a badly designed one which didn't actually protect lots of people who needed it. But polling by the RSA in 2020 found that support for basic income was across all age groups and all political affiliations, but concerns about how the policy would be funded and how others would spend the money was consistent across all groups and even among supporters of basic income. It's a strange policy in the sense that it gathers support from both those on the left and the right of the political spectrum. And this is why it's important to understand the different interpretations of the policy and the objectives of the advocates and what they hope to achieve with it. And, like with any policy, the devil is always in the detail. But basic income has been referred to by different names, for example, citizens' income, a social wage, commons dividend, and even a freedom dividend, which was coined by Andrew Yang, when he was running for president of the US, who's in the picture here. So, often UBI is viewed as this kind of utopian idea, which would act as a means to redistribute wealth, reduce inequality, and increase security for everyone in society. And that's definitely the view I have of it. But there's also a fear that basic income would be used as a neoliberal Trojan horse and a means to dismantle and remove all welfare provision. In this case, basic income would effectively be seen as giving tokens to citizens that they could then trade in for education, healthcare, and other services that would be provided on the free market. So again, it's important to state here that this is not what I would be advocating for, and I would actively campaign against this sort of the neoliberal Trojan horse version. Basic income should be a part of a strong welfare state, and extra support should be provided for those who need it. There is, of course, legitimate concern from those with disabilities and other needs who fear that basic income would be a way of sort of removing this support, which has been instilled and, as Rona mentioned earlier on, has been eroded progressively over time. With this in mind, UBI Lab Disability have written a paper proposing a reform to the current welfare system called UBI Plus, which would provide everyone in society with a basic income, and there would be an extra sort of bolt-on allowances for people who have extra costs. And yeah, I can put the link to that proposal in the chat later on. So skeptics like to sort of present UBI as free money or money for nothing, which I think is very disingenuous and a deliberate ploy to discredit the idea. A common argument against basic income is that there's no such thing as a free lunch. Joy Pananda from the German organization Mein Grundeinkommen, or My Basic Income, feels that we should view basic income as as a free breakfast, which would give us the nourishment to be able to go out and earn our lunch or anything else we might need. Personally, I view basic income as a way of investing in society and as a means to reward all the unpaid labor that is currently not seen as work, but which society relies on for it to function. UBI would also support the work of artists, musicians, and other creative practitioners who are not motivated by money. UBI would provide the financial support to work on projects without worrying if they would be commercially successful. And a good basic income would create a secure platform for everyone to build their lives on, and it would give them more autonomy and the ability to engage in activity which they find meaningful instead of having to work just for money. And this is the main reason why I support the idea and why I think it would benefit artists and other creative practitioners. Okay, so now that I've outlined sort of what basic income is, I'll run through a few of the common arguments against basic income. So the first one being that basic income would be a disincentive to work, and it would just make everyone lazy and they'd quit their jobs. So, I mean, no one I've spoken to has said that they would stop working if they received a UBI, but a lot of them do believe that other people would. And I think this is just, you can put this down to a lack of trust in others. Now, I think that musicians and artists, anyone creative, are good examples of people who wouldn't stop working if they received a basic income. It would just give them the means to put more time and energy into the work which they might not get paid to do. Another example is lottery winners. Almost universally, they continue to work, although it's often not in their previous jobs. Basic income would be a means for many people to leave exploitative jobs and find more fulfilling work to do. And a good UBI would effectively act as a permanent strike fund, which would increase workers' bargaining power. Other people believe that we wouldn't spend our money responsibly, we would just spend it on beer and crisps. However, evidence from trials has shown that with few exceptions, participants did not spend money on alcohol, tobacco, or drugs. Quite often, the consumption of these things went down. Instead, they would use it to improve their household welfare. And trials have also found that there's been a decline in crime and domestic abuse. Another argument is, why should we give it to rich people? Well, whether we like it or not, rich people are members of society too. And so if the policy is going to be universal, then they should also receive it. Let's see, the rich may not always receive their high salaries. For example, what happens if they have an accident and can't play football anymore? So, UBI would give them the same level of security as everyone else in society. This way, the universality of it would build solidarity, much like the NHS does. Universal payments would be cheaper and fairer, as the bureaucracy of means testing is expensive and it often creates a barrier to people who are eligible to claiming benefits, so they don't actually bother doing it. And ultimately, the rich would pay their universal basic income back in tax pretty much straight away. Okay, and then finally, it would cost too much. Skeptics always like to focus on the gross cost of basic income. They sort of quote these huge numbers. But the net cost of basic income would be much smaller than the gross cost, as there'd be huge savings through things like the reduction of visits to the NHS through better mental health and physical health, for example. But we do need to acknowledge that basic income would be expensive, but so is not implementing it. We already spend vast amounts of money on alleviating the effects of poverty. Basic income would help reduce the effects of poverty by addressing the root cause, which is often income inequality. And so if the pandemic has shown us anything, it's that we're all interdependent on one another. And there is money for policies that support us in times of crisis. I mean, the furlough scheme is a point in case. And just imagine how much easier life would have been during the first lockdown if we already had a basic income. It would have given everyone a level of support, would have let us figure out things, and sort of people would have been able to engage in more mutual aid and things like that. And so it's important to state that basic income is not a silver bullet, and there are many reasons to be wary of it, especially a badly implemented version of it. Okay, so I haven't covered every aspect of UBI here, but hopefully that's a good starting point for a discussion. So I'll stop sharing my screen now, and then we'll see what if anyone has any questions. Okay.
It's great. Cheers, Toby. It's really useful to have the overview again, and I think the idea partly was to if we've got some new people here, it's nice to sort of do a bit of recapping and revisiting on it. I was just sort of picking up on the conversation that was happening in the chat there about the difference between UBI and minimum income guarantee, which I think has been sort of addressed, but I don't know if anyone wanted to say more about that. Just that the universal basic income, the kind of thing that makes it UBI is the non-means tested element in that. Is that right? Is that kind of essentially what was getting discussed in the chat there? Was there any more kind of clarification that you wanted on it?
I suppose there is more to say on that, but basically that is the difference. It's not dependent on people's behavior, so you don't have to be looking for a job or things like that, but in effect it's targeted because it's meant for people on the lowest incomes. And as soon as your income or other sources of income increase, then it's immediately withdrawn at quite a high rate. So what you get is very quickly taken away. So in that sense, it's like universal credit, and you can't really plan in that sort of situation. It just keeps you in a poverty trap where you are. So that is not the intention of UBI. So that's quite a large difference. But there are other aspects of it which might be similar. And so some people in favor of UBI think it might be good as a stepping stone from where we are now.
Thank you, Eleanor. I mean, I just wanted to, I would just follow up on that sort of question as well, Toby, because you mentioned the sort of UBI Lab disability lab, and they're kind of talking about a UBI plus, which would be, I mean, would that be bringing in a sort of means tested or a conditional element into universal basic income then?
I guess if I'm brutally honest, I haven't read their report, but the way that I understand it is that they acknowledge that there are people in society who do have additional costs, and it's a way of their proposal is to look at the current welfare system and sort of replace it with a basic income which everyone would receive, but then also have and I guess there would be I imagine a means tested aspect of that. I know that there are other people who think that we should just have a really high basic income for everyone and remove all kind of welfare provision, but the provision of these, or the proviso alongside this, is that people shouldn't have to prove that they're disabled, or it should just be if you do have a disability, you just get the stuff which you need. So whether it's a wheelchair or a disability car and things like that. Rona, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, I want to come in as a disabled person, not a person who has a disability. The distinction being that as a disabled person, according to the social model, we are disabled by society and society's inaccessibility and failure to meet our needs. Obviously tonight being a bit of a case in point, but there are more extreme examples. So I am not a person with a disability, I'm a disabled person, firstly. Secondly, I just want to say that we at the moment receive something from the DWP, if we're very, very lucky, and if we fight hard enough, called personal independence payment, which was the replacement for the old disability living allowance. Our personal independence payment is all very well, but there are 4 models that the government will be looking at, one in Switzerland, one in New Zealand, I can't remember the other 2. And those models are merged with the welfare system. So what the government are proposing to do in a green paper is merge personal independence payment at a much lower rate than it is now with universal credit. Now, I've just come today from a meeting that my friend's sister had a meeting. She's 65 years old. She has multiple disabilities, including mental health issues and physical disabilities. She is 3 months away from her pension, and they had a meeting. They called her into a meeting saying, if you don't attend this meeting, you'll be sanctioned, and they want to put her back to work. We kind of thought, we kind of came to a bit of an agreement about, 2 hours work. If she's sitting down, 2 hours work doing what she loves, it's probably, possibly a good idea. But ultimately, when you think about it, if she were to, sort of be on a system like a UBI, instead of having to depend on universal credit to sustain her and keep her in food, we wouldn't be having this conversation. If she wanted to work, she'd work. If she didn't want to work, she wouldn't work. But the conditionality of universal credit is that she has to work. And of course, being a personal independence payment, because there are higher costs associated with being a disabled person. For example, I can barely walk, so I get taxis everywhere. So there are extra costs involved with being physically impaired. So that would be merged in with universal credit, so it would become conditional. So not only would I have to sort of prove that I'm looking for work on pain of a sanction, but I'd have to prove that I'm looking for work on pain of a sanction for universal credit and for personal independence payment, which is basically, at the moment, the closest that we have for disabled people to a UBI.
Thanks, Fiona. So, I mean, maybe that's a conversation to follow up then, specifically in the lab that's focused on it, but it does seem just, from my, not that we can go into it too much detail now, but this idea of then bringing in a conditional element or a sort of a means tested element into the UBI would kind of, would be problematic at some point, but sounds interesting to bring it up. Is there, I'm just thinking, is there any other sort of questions or comments on what Toby was talking about that might be useful to bring up at this point? We're going to save some time at the end as well to sort of have a bit more discussion if doesn't have to come in straight away. Go ahead, Martin. Yeah.
suppose one of the things, and maybe it reflects an ambivalence in my mind about UBI, is you know, easily kind of knocked sideways by some of the criticisms of it, whether they're, you know, fair or not. And I suppose one of the questions perhaps is about this. I suppose this notion of a stepping stone, and you know, Red was starting to talk about UBI plus, and it was on a NEF meeting when they were launching their minimum income idea, and there was a lot of discussion there again about disabilities, people with disabilities or disabled people, and how they might lose out to a UBI or a minimum income scheme. And it becomes very complex suddenly. And I suppose, should we be thinking about stepping stones as a way to get into UBI, or, you know, to get there and to get the sort of version which is, I suppose, pure in the sense that Toby was going to be talking about? Do we just need to push for that and make the argument straight up? And, you know, I'm still kind of tussling with this myself. I'm not entirely sure. So it'd be interesting to hear others' views about that at some point.
I was just going to sort of join that, or make the link with what Arun's put in the chat there as well, about sort of eligibility for UBI being based on citizenship, and kind of like this is another access, you know, point of, well, how does it get implemented? Because unless it's universal, as in it happens everywhere all at the same time, you're going to have issues around, yeah, proving citizenship of the place and borders, and what does it mean if Luton has universal basic income and Bedford doesn't, you know, what happens at the border, you know, that it could, yeah, create some reasons. So that's a very interesting thing to bring up, I think, for, yeah, that sort of idea of how does it happen, yeah, if it's not a gradual process. And then Momoko, did you want to, I mean, maybe you could sort of vocalize that in the chat as well.
Hello, can you hear me? I was just asking, Toby, I kind of wrote it, so I'm just kind of saying what I wrote, but you touched on how...
Can you slow down, please? I'm struggling to hear you.
Yeah, sure. So I've written it as well in the chat, but Toby touched on the fact that rich people would pay the UBI they receive back in tax, but I was just wondering, with the extent to which the UBI system depends on taxing the rich, depend on the details of the model we would be advocating for implementing, because I think the ideal model of how to pay for it might depend a little bit on the country. And I was wondering, in the UK in particular, what kind of models have been suggested in terms of paying for UBI?
So I guess this is the really tricky part, you know, because it's like, how would you fund it is the bit which often is the sticking point. And yeah, I know, but there's always this sort of you know, seeing the rich as a way of as the fund for it. And if I'm honest, I don't have an answer to this at the moment. I think, you know, it's particularly to the question, but why should we give it to rich people? I think for me, the answer is simple in terms of that, yeah, that there would be a tax system, hopefully a more progressive one, but we have at the moment, which, you know, any money which they would receive, they would pay back straight away. I know that there's different models for basic income where you would, you know, where it would function like a negative income tax. So once you earn a certain amount over a certain threshold, your UBI goes down or you would lose it. And I think, you know, even in that kind of scenario, I would say that it's better than what we have at the moment, because, you know, especially like if you're on universal credit, for example, you know, it's not worth working because you lose so much money just by working. And again, you know, I can do some more research into this and find, you know, send you some more specific examples. But yeah, with the actual models of how it gets funded, I think we very quickly get tied up in numbers, which especially it's above my pay grade or my expertise and that sort of thing. And I don't want to you know, send us down too many rabbit holes in that point, if that makes sense. But I think it is a really important thing which the UBI Lab or UBI movement need to address, because it is something which we'll always come back to, is how do you pay for it? I know that there's ideas of sovereign wealth funds or things like that, which or it's whether you're redistributing money which we already have or creating new money to pay for it. And again, you come into a load of economic arguments which are beyond my my pay scale, if that makes sense. So I'm not avoiding the question, but I think if we can move on, that would be all right for now.
I mean, I suppose it's, again, as a thing, just to welcome everyone and sort of for people that are new to the sort of UBI Lab Arts, it is important to know that we're part of that bigger network, and there are sort of like
Sorry,
other
Andy, can you
little.
please slow down? I can't understand you.
Sure. So there are other labs that are kind of looking at the detail around what we're sort of discussing as the policy, and specifically with the UBI Lab Arts, we were sort of thinking about how we could focus more on the broadening and deepening of the conversation in terms of how it's kind of bringing in different people or framing it in a different way as well. So I think it's really nice that we're part of that larger network that we can sort of draw on rather than feel that as a group of artists we have to have all the answers. There are kind of people that are very sort of that are looking at that that are our allies and ways of people's whose expertise we can draw on. I think, as Rona brought up, there's the Basic Income Earth Network conference next week that we'll all be joining and part of as well, which is free access, isn't it now? So could be a good place to sort of follow up on these specific details.
Yeah, just to go back to Martin's point as well about the sort of the stepping stone aspects of it and all these kinds of things. I think this is why it's important to have a good understanding, or at least a good understanding as possible, on the different versions of what basic income is and the different names of it, so we know what we could what we need to resist or what we need to push back against. So if there was something which would affect people with disabilities disproportionately, leaving them worse off, we should definitely resist that. But also I think it is worth pushing for the utopian aspect of it, because it's almost like saying if you're reaching for the top shelf, you might get something slightly further down, but if we're only sort of asking for a piecemeal kind of thing, then that will easily get eroded as well. So I think the role of artists and musicians, etc., it is to push for the utopian aspect as much as possible, and then hopefully we'll be able to overreach a bit further and get something else which is actually beneficial for people and makes life better for everyone. Helena, do you want to come in?
Yeah, just quickly, I don't want to be misleading people because it is rather complicated, but it has been costed by one economist, Carl Wilderquist, for 67 billion, and furlough has been, the budget and furlough has been more than that. So that's not a very high UBI, but if you're starting somewhere, that's possible. A full UBI is much more than 67, but at this stage, I don't think anyone's asking for that because it would just be too difficult. I've always wondered whether it should be funded by more than one source, i.e. income tax and something else. That would make sense. And the Sovereign Wealth Fund is an attractive idea. Especially in recent times, people have been talking about taxing tech companies. Even Rishi Sunak has been talking about trying to do a global effort to tax tech companies. I mean, good luck with that. Not an easy task, but there is a lot of money there. And bearing in mind how our economies are more and more designed to remove jobs, how do you compensate for people for technology taking up people's jobs? If technology is doing that, then really there should be a dividend on technology. So there are discussions about that, but it's about how do you force these things into being, and there isn't a simple solution to that.
Rona, do you want to come in?
Me. Hello.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Did you say my name?
Oh, sorry. I thought you had your hand raised.
I do. I had my hand up. I wasn't sure if you called on me.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Do you want to come in?
Yeah. Amazon and Google don't pay tax, and they aren't the only ones. And there are a lot of people who have tax havens in the Canary Islands, and those who have seen about the possibility of Bitcoin and other types of currency are trying to avoid taxes by putting their money into Bitcoins and those other types of currency. And there was a movie called The Spider's Web a few years ago, a brilliant movie called The Spider's Web, and it's all about the whole history of tax evasion, just going back even to the Middle Ages, the whole history of tax avoidance and tax evasion. I don't know how many of you have heard of a book called The Ragged Trousered Philanthropist, but it was written in 1904, and there is a remarkable similarity in a lot of respects to the life that we live now, even down to the fact that as factories become more automated, it will leave fewer jobs available. And this was 1904 we're talking about. And of course, they have the wonderful work capability assessment at the end of the book, where people are sort of assessed as whether they're fit for work. And of course, if they're over 60, then they're kind of just sent out with the clothes on their back. And there was no such thing as a pension in those days. And there were some slight differences, but for the most part, I think the conversations we're having about technology is going to take over human jobs, and what do they do there? And that's a much older conversation than we realize. And I don't think we have a government that's going to be conducive to going after huge organizations and corporations who are avoiding taxes, because they'll more likely be shareholders in those organizations. That's what I think anyway.
Yeah, that's a good point.